Particularly in the early days of the web, a lot of communication theorists really looked at the internet as being inherently a force for democratizing societies, particularly those that were already somewhat repressive and had heavy censorship regimes. Have your travels reinforced that idea at all? Have they challenged them? Or what?
I think, went on this trip wondering whether I would think that, and I think the book concludes in many ways that the web is not in itself a democratizer, or should I say, it doesn't democratise in a Western sense. For example, very few people I met looked at Australia or America and said, we want to be like them. Now, yes, they may say they'd like to have more political freedom or media freedom or personal freedom, but most places I went to, with exceptions, people were very much of the belief they wanted to have either a religious country, maybe a more liberal religious country. Now, America, I think, is a religious country more so than Australia or the UK or much of Europe, but I think there is a mistake often in the West that if people have access to the web, by definition they're going to suddenly want to break into democracy and start singing songs to capitalism. It's not going to happen, which I think is a good thing. And ultimately I think many people who I spoke to, as I said, look at the West and often admire popular culture. Like I remember in Havana speaking to many people, and satellite television was banned then, but everyone was watching it. And you have a state which is inherently critical of the US and anti-US, has been for 50 years. But you have many young Cubans who I met who are really interested in engaging with hip-hop culture and testing how they look, how they dress, and really looking at hip-hop guys in LA and kind of wanting to be like them. I don't think they had a desire to go to LA, to live in America, but they want to have the freedom to choose to be able to go to LA if they could afford it, for example. So I think what's interesting is that many of the discussions that I wrote about in the book about politics and a political system is not really so much about people who want to embrace what we have, but it gives them a forum to actually discuss what is possible, which wasn't so possible before because, as I said, state-run media is very narrow in its outlook. So what always was frustrating for me was a lot of the writings in the last 5 years, say since 9/11, by a lot of conservative commentators in America, since 9/11 and since the Iraq War, is that if only they over there saw what we had, they'd be gagged to have what we have. The fact that they believe it should be at the barrel of a gun, I think, is a bit of a problem, like Iraq or whatever, or what they planned to do in Iran and Syria. There's no doubt that if Iraq had gone well, so to speak, and it hadn't been a complete disaster, that the Bush administration was planning to do similar things to Iran and Syria, and thankfully that hasn't happened yet. But I think the democratisation can happen, but it happens on their terms and how they want it to be. And I was really conscious when I was doing the book of not preaching what I think. There's things I have views about what should happen in Iran. Of course I have views about it and I write about it. But like anywhere and like any people, there's no desire to be told how things should be. And too many people, I think, Westerners, go to many of these kind of countries and they write about them in a way that suggests that how could they not want what we have in the West? And yes, sometimes they might want to have some of the things that we have, but often they want to have it on their own terms. And it's a shame that many Western journalists and much Western media doesn't frame it that way, as I think it is in reality.
Looking at the online community or the blogosphere or whatever you like to call it, there is a kind of sense that even though writers do tend to link to each other and there is a real sense of community, in a lot of ways it does seem quite insular. Do you think it's... How far-reaching would you say that the writers of the blog and their opinions actually go in terms of the wider society?
In, say, non-Western countries?
Or
just generally?
Well, you could use Australia as an example, but also in non-Western countries.
Well, is the web or blogosphere inherently insular? Yes and no. Is it often incredibly kind of nerdy and self-referential? Yes, it is, and to some extent other countries is not that dissimilar about that. But I think if one looks at, say, net penetration in many countries, it's very high, and not everybody, of course, is blogging. I mean, in China, for example, we have a lot of people who are online. They aren't all blogging. In fact, in China, there are other sort of things that are far more popular than blogging, other sort of online media, so social networking type stuff, rather than blogging. I think to me, a lot of the mainstream media is incredibly insular as well. That if you often meet up with a lot of journalists, which I do, unfortunately, sometimes, there is a sense that they are very much referencing each other a lot, which is the same as online. There's no difference to that. What I think has changed in the last sort of 5 or 10 years online is the fact that it's now allowed people to actually have a debate about things and get new voices in there. Now, it can still be cliquey and insular and all that sort of stuff, but to me in Australia, for example, the online community, if you can call it that, is sort of fragmented and disparate, and there's no sort of overarching narrative about what the web is and what happens to it. But the majority of Australians are online. There are some parts of the community that can't afford it, that's true, but the vast majority are online and use it for something. Most of them are not blogging, that's true, and most people still engage with much of the mainstream media that's on their websites, but I think that is changing, and many of the studies in the US and much of the West suggest that many people like the fact that there's now greater choice. The fact that they still might go to the New York Times first rather than a blog is just because they either inherently trust the New York Times, or they think, well, I can get my kind of daily news diet, in 10 minutes. And I read the New York Times every day too, just to see what they say. Even though I don't think it's a very good newspaper, but I want to see what it says. And I think there is a mistaken belief in much of the discussion about the web that suggests that somehow it's only nerds talking to each other. And maybe that was the case 10, 15 years ago, where it was that. But in China is a good example. 10 years ago there were 100,000 web users. There are now 250 million. And yes, there are 1.3 billion people, so it's still a minority of China, that's true, but there's no reason it's increasing by 6 million a month. It's massive. And a lot of the people who are using the web in China, so actually are using it in, yes, the cities, but also rural areas too. So there is a perception, people would say, well, it's just the middle class elites. Well, yes, it's not the total absolute peasants, that's true, but you are finding in China in the last 5 years that one of the great growth areas actually, as I say in my book, are people in rural areas, farmers who are engaging with issues that are relevant to their area. And interestingly enough, the government in China, including in Egypt too, and Iran, has provided a lot of infrastructure to allow people to use the web in areas that are away from the city. So in some ways that disproves the theory that it's just middle class people talking to each other. It is that, but it's also far more than that too.